you, Doug. I know you've been doing what you do very well for a very long time, so I think we all certainly appreciate your advice and expertise. Our final speaker this session is Jeremy Grant, Managing Director, Technology Business Strategy, Venable. Please join me in welcoming Jeremy to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. Boker Tov. Thank you for having me here today. I was really sympathetic before listening to Josh talk about the troubles getting lunch yesterday. I had some of them as well arriving in the middle of the afternoon, although I thought it was appropriate that everybody at a cybersecurity conference was executing a DDoS attack on the lunch tables. I came, there was no food, I couldn't get anything. More lunch came, and then people swarmed. Once again, there was no lunch. So I also was a bit hungry and unsatisfied, although I got some good cookies later in the afternoon. So I'm thrilled to be here today in Tel Aviv. My background, I've spent more than 20 years at the intersection of cybersecurity and identity, spent 4.5 years at NIST leading the cyber identity team, including implementation of a major US initiative, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. I now work as Managing Director at Venable, Technology and Business Strategy. We're a law firm with the country's, the US's at least, largest cybersecurity and privacy practice. So I'm here today to talk about something important around identity. The theme of identity is the great enabler. Not only as a fundamental building block of better cybersecurity, but as something that is a foundation for more trusted, high-value transactions online. So I've had a bit of a problem the last year, which is that I keep getting invited to conferences in the fintech space, something I've never done before. Cybersecurity, I'm used to the conference scene. Fintech's been something new, although it's been fun to get to new conferences. And one of the reasons as an identity guy I keep getting asked to come was really summed up in a PayPal report that they put out about 6 weeks ago called Fintech from the Front Lines, which is basically to say that looking across everything that we're trying to do in fintech these days, more innovative payments, better ways to manage your money, new ways to store or exchange your money. Identity is a precursor to access fintech, but identity is continuing to languish in analog forms that are difficult to build upon for the provision of digital services. And this is making it difficult to actually execute many of the more interesting fintech use cases that we've been looking for. The problem today really dates back to a cartoon that's going to be 24 years old next week. Pete Steiner in the New Yorker 24 years ago put out a great cartoon where a dog's on the computer and he says to his friend the dog on the internet, "Nobody knows you're a dog." And we're still dealing with this issue today. Although there's arguably been some evolution in the kinds of information we're able to figure out, certainly if you're certain intelligence agencies with abilities to collect certain types of information. But for those of us who are just mere mortals, we're still dealing with something that's a pretty simple problem, at least on paper. The dog's getting old. 24 years in dog years, that dog should be up in heaven now, but here we are today. And the problem, at least when we start looking at fintech and other things that we want to do online, more high-value, high-trust services, is with things like know your customer and anti-money laundering regulations. Identity comes down to that. Security, how do we deliver really easy-to-use, secure login experiences so you can't get phished, you can't get breached with a stolen credential? That's where we come to identity again. How do we deliver these solutions in a way that respects privacy and potentially even enhances it? How do we deliver a better customer experience, more streamlined, more bespoke, personalized applications? How do we develop these things in a way that can actually reduce transaction costs? Because if we're adding on layers of security and other regulations and requirements, and it makes things more expensive, that undermines a lot of the use cases for using this technology in the first place. And a lot of this all really comes down at the end of the day to how do we enable more trusted transactions online? And trust, it turns out, is something that's very hard to get right. But identity, when delivered right, can enable trust. Identity is the great enabler. So what do I mean by that? Well, identity, digital identity, when you deliver it right, can provide a foundation for digital transactions and online experiences that are more secure, that are easier to use and more respectful of privacy than what we have in most online applications today. But there's a big but here. This is the point where my 6-year-old would say, "Dad, you just said but in the presentation." So 6-year-old boys are great. The big but, it has to be secure, because as we'll talk about in the next few slides, identity is where the hackers are attacking the most. And it has to be easy to use because at the end of the day, consumers aren't going to put up with any security that degrades the user experience. In fact, they'll just click out of the app and go to a competitor. So we got to make both of these a reality. And the problem on the security side is that increasingly identity is the first point of attack. So one of my favorite studies that comes out every year is Verizon's annual data breach investigations report. It's not just Verizon who writes this, they work with a bunch of other security companies, and they work with law enforcement agencies around the world to digest what happened over the previous year in breaches. So the 2017 report came out a couple months ago. What tactics do they use? 81% of breaches last year leveraged either stolen or weak passwords. That's a stunning number. And by the way, this is not a new thing. Every year that they've been doing the report for the last 6 or 7 years, it's been somewhere between 2/3 and 80%. 81 is a new high, but it's not a particularly good number. This problem keeps happening time and time again. Passwords are a recipe for disaster. When you go and look at most of the major breaches of the last few years, this is a bit of a US-centric slide, but big ones that have been in the news, starting with Target back in 2013, JP Morgan Chase, Apple iCloud, what was known as the JLE, the Jennifer Lawrence event to some in the Apple community, when a number of different celebrities had their passwords phished, compromised, and suddenly some very personal pictures and videos were exposed over the internet. Home Depot, Sony Pictures, Anthem, the biggest health insurer in the US, in the Office of Personnel Management, both Doug and I now have all of our top secret background check information, thanks to a breached password, sitting in China, along, at least in my case, with all 10 of my fingerprint images, which gives me some concerns about biometrics in the cloud, but that's another story. Last year's Bangladesh Bake Heist, stolen SWIFT credentials. The hack of the Democratic National Committee last summer, passwords once again to get in. This is a pretty common theme. And unfortunately, the problem's been getting worse. The anti-phishing work group showed that from 2015 to 2016, there was a 65% increase in phishing attacks, a 40% increase in breaches year to year. And just last week, I was at a conference in Chicago where the head of Microsoft's identity services was talking, and he said that a year ago, Microsoft, this was just one major cloud service alone, was seeing attempts to compromise 20 million accounts per day. Well, now that's quintupled. Now it's 100 million accounts per day. So in the 1930s, they asked the bank robber Willie Sutton, why is it that you rob banks? He said, well, that's where the money is. Why are attackers going after passwords? Because that's the way to get to the data. So when you have an increase of 5 times in just 1 year, that shows that there's some real problems here to be concerned about. And the problem, unfortunately, goes beyond passwords. So we've been trying to layer on second factors on top of passwords for years. And, frankly, the security's been helpful, the user experience not so much. Google in 2011 did a great thing for the security community for average consumers. They came up with a free app called Authenticator you could download onto your smartphone, and you would get a one-time password that would be good for 30 seconds as a second factor. Well, that really, really helped in the Google ecosystem for about 4 years. And then 2 years ago, Eric Sachs, who runs identity at Google, got up on stage at the Cloud Identity Summit and said, the bad guys have caught up. It might only be good for 30 seconds, that one-time password, but these days, an attacker can successfully phish for that one-time password just after they phish your original credential. So there's a bigger message that comes out of this, which is that all shared secrets are phishable. It doesn't matter if it's a static password or one that changes. These days in 2017, the attackers have caught up. So I've given you a lot of bad news over the last few slides, but now I'm going to talk about some good news that's happening, which is that people aren't just sitting by and looking at this and throwing up their hands and asking, what do we do? The market has been responding. So strong authentication is suddenly getting much easier. What used to require something like a standalone smart card token and a reader that you would somehow hook up to your machine, or a dongle that you would carry with a flashing one-time password, or a standalone biometric reader, all of the basic security functionality, or in many cases, the devices themselves, are now shipping to the box in these things that you all have in your hands, in your briefcase today. Some of you are probably tweeting about what I'm saying right now on them. And these things, it turns out, are pretty interesting because there's some common elements that are shipping in all of them these days. So the first is secure hardware-based isolated execution environments. That's a mouthful, but think of the TPM chips in Windows laptops, the trusted execution environment in an Android phone, the secure enclave in an Apple iPhone. They all go by different names, but they're all basically the same thing. Something that's isolated from the rest of the device that's capable of generating, securing, and applying cryptographic keys. They also come with biometric sensors built in. It's pretty hard to find a device these days that doesn't do finger, face, and voice, and many of the cameras for face can also be used for iris recognition. And they've got some other sensors and capabilities that can also feed into identity and authentication decisions. So what we're now seeing today is that these devices are shipping with security built in, strong multi-factor authentication. All of the primitives are basically there to take advantage of in the marketplace. And a lot of this is being enabled by a cross-industry effort called the FIDO Alliance, which I'm going to talk about for the next few slides, that's making all of this happen across platforms. So what is FIDO? It's an industry organization of more than 250 members, mostly companies, but some governments. Both the UK and the US government are both members. And it's focused on a single thing: better authentication standards based on public key cryptography that's unphishable to solve the password problem. Today in the marketplace, there's more than 340 FIDO certified solutions in the market. In total, FIDO is now available to protect more than 3.5 billion user accounts worldwide. This is in part to firms like Google and Facebook that have deployed it across their users. So to talk about how FIDO is different, I just want to take a minute to talk about how Old Authentication works. So I talked before about shared secrets. It's a pretty simple concept. I know something, the server I'm logging into knows something, I pass that over. Whether that secret's good for 30 seconds or in perpetuity, it's still phishable. So what FIDO introduces is something that's a bit of a different concept into the equation, which is this thing called an authenticator that sits in the middle. So in step one, I'll authenticate locally to my device, leveraging those secure, protected, isolated execution environments that I talked about, generally with a biometric of some sort, but it doesn't have to be. And then behind the scenes, the authenticator leverages public key crypto to log me in to the server itself. So FIDO, the technology and the standard's interesting, but it's important to talk about who's driving it, because it really makes the point of what's actually happening in the marketplace. So for starters, Google and Microsoft, generally cats and dogs fighting, but here they're working together side by side. Major banks like Bank of America, ING, USAA, all three of the major payment card networks, other players in payments like PayPal and Alibaba, Aetna, major health insurer in the US, NTT Docomo, the biggest mobile network operator in Japan, hardware manufacturers like Lenovo and Samsung, chip makers like Intel, Qualcomm, ARM, Infineon, and NXP. All those devices you're holding in your hand right now or have in your briefcase, they're making the secure elements that go into these devices, and they're embedding FIDO in at the chip level. And a whole bunch of other security vendors. And this is just the board, 34 members. The other 220 or so are sponsor members, associates, and liaisons. It's pretty hard these days now to buy a phone that isn't FIDO certified, in part because Qualcomm has built it into their chipset, and Google has now just recently announced they'll be building it in at the OS level as well onto Android. I mentioned before, Apple's, while they don't join standards organizations, they have conveniently architected their device to support FIDO through third-party software, and so we're seeing Bank of America, NTT Docomo in Japan, eBay all deploying it. Microsoft, if you look at the Windows platform, Windows 10, Windows Hello is their passwordless login. That's enabled by the FIDO standards. They built it on the FIDO platform. You can use finger or face to log in, but it's not just biometric login. It's login with biometric plus the public key crypto behind the scenes. And later this summer, the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, a standards body, will finalize the web authentication standard, which will come up with an easy way to embed FIDO in all major browsers. Now, governments are taking notice and approve. Ian talked about this document before. He's right. It's not total crap. It's actually pretty good. National Cybersecurity Strategy. He talked a lot about DDoS before, and not DDoS, but DMARC, which is an amazing standard that needs more focus. Another focus of the strategy was focusing on how can we actually make consumer devices secure by default, so we don't have to keep trying to bolt on security. And they specifically called out FIDO as one standard to invest in, saying we need to focus on things that don't rely on passwords for user authentication, but instead use the machine and other devices in the user's possession to authenticate. And just last week, my old agency, NIST, in the US government released its new digital identity guidelines, where they specifically called out FIDO at the highest authenticator assurance level recognized by NIST. So in summary, we are on the cusp of the no passwords world. Nearly every device we use will soon ship with unphishable authentication. It's easier to use than passwords and other types of multi-factor authentication, basically leveraging biometrically enabled single gesture strong authentication without a password, backed by both strong standards as well as a new security certification program to measure the security of the implementations. We are finally on the cusp of delivering identity as the great enabler. So thank you very much. Toda rabah.